The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor wax, the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone's holding their breath. Sunlight cut through the high windows in thin, dusty lines, landing on rows of worn wooden benches filled with people waiting for their turn, some nervous, some bored, a few just trying to stay awake. At the front, behind a tall oak bench that looked more like a throne than a piece of furniture, sat the judge. She wasn't new to the job. Years of rulings, gavels, and late nights reviewing case files had carved a permanent sharpness into her expression. Her robe hung perfectly. Her hair was pinned back tight, and her eyes scanned the room like she was already tired of everyone in it before they'd even spoken. A bailiff called the next case. A man walked in, average height, plain clothes, no lawyer beside him. He moved calmly like he'd done this before, though his hands stayed clasped in front of him, fingers slightly tense. He stopped at the defendant's table, gave a small nod to the judge, and waited. The charge was simple: failure to produce valid vehicle registration during a traffic stop. Not a crime that would make headlines, not even the kind of thing most people would remember by lunchtime. But in this courtroom on this morning, it was enough to set everything in motion. The officer who'd made the stop gave his statement. Short, factual, no drama. The man listened, then stepped forward when it was his turn to speak. His voice was low but clear. He explained that his registration had been renewed online just 2 days before the stop, but the system hadn't updated in time. He'd printed the confirmation email and brought it with him today, along with a letter from the motor vehicle office confirming the delay wasn't his fault. He laid the papers gently on the clerk's desk, not pushing, not demanding, just offering. The judge barely glanced at the documents. She'd seen 100 excuses like this. To her, it was just another person trying to talk their way out of responsibility. She leaned forward slightly, her tone dry, almost amused. "So let me get this straight," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You expect the officer and this court to believe that it's somehow not your job to make sure your car is legally registered before you drive it? That the system should bend for you, but you don't need to plan ahead?" A few people in the gallery shifted. One woman looked down at her lap. The man didn't flinch. He just said, "No, Your Honor. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just showing that I did what I was supposed to do." The delay was on their end. She cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Spare me the lecture on bureaucracy. People like you show up here every day thinking rules are optional. You had every chance to get it right. Instead, you wasted an officer's time and now mine." The words landed like slaps. Not because they were shouted, but because they were delivered with such cold certainty, like she'd already decided who he was before he'd even opened his mouth. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. The man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there for a moment, quiet, then gave another small nod, almost respectful, and stepped back. She didn't hesitate. "Guilty," she announced as if it were obvious. "Standard fine, plus an additional penalty for contempt of court decorum. You'll pay double. Next case." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed off the walls. People started shuffling, turning to leave, or whispering to each other. Most assumed that was it. The man would pay his fine, grumble about judges on his way out, and life would go on. But he didn't move. While others filed out, he stayed exactly where he was, hands still clasped, eyes fixed on the bench. The judge noticed. She frowned slightly, expecting another outburst or plea. Instead, he reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim black wallet. He opened it just enough to show her the contents. No fanfare, no drama. Her eyes narrowed, then widened. Inside wasn't a driver's license or a business card. It was an official federal badge. Below it, clear lettering, Office of Judicial Conduct and Ethics Authorized Inspector, and beneath that a photo that matched the face standing before her. For a heartbeat, the courtroom was utterly silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. He closed the wallet but didn't put it away. "Your Honor," he said, still calm, still quiet. "I was here this morning as part of a routine unannounced observation of courtroom procedures and judicial conduct."
My role is to ensure that the standards of fairness, impartiality,
"And respect are upheld in every proceeding, especially by those entrusted with the bench." She stared at him, lips slightly parted as if trying to find the punchline in a joke that wasn't funny. "This is some kind of mistake," she finally said, voice tighter now. "You were listed as a defendant." The docket was adjusted for operational security," he replied. "My presence here was cleared through federal channels. What I witnessed today, your remarks, your tone, your immediate dismissal of evidence without review, falls well outside acceptable judicial behavior. Public humiliation of a litigant, especially one without counsel, violates multiple codes of conduct. She started to stand, her chair scraping loudly. You can't just— I'm not charging you with a crime, he interrupted gently. But I am required to place you on temporary administrative hold pending a full ethics review. You'll need to step down from the bench for now. Her face flushed. Do you have any idea who I am? How long I've served? The cases I've handled? I do, he said. And that's exactly why this matters. The bench isn't a stage for authority. It's a promise to the public. When that promise is broken even once, it erodes trust for everyone who walks through these doors. Before she could respond, the courtroom doors opened again. 2 U.S. Marshals entered, not rushing, not aggressive, but with the quiet certainty of people who knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't speak. They just stood near the bench, waiting. The judge looked around at the emptying gallery, at the clerk avoiding her eyes, at the bailiff suddenly very interested in his clipboard. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control. And worse, she knew why. She took a slow breath. Then another. The arrogance that had carried her through the morning cracked just slightly, revealing something underneath. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. The inspector didn't gloat. Didn't smirk. He simply said, "Please come with us. You'll be escorted to a secure room while we begin the intake process. You'll have full access to legal counsel and the opportunity to respond formally." She hesitated, then nodded stiffly. As she stepped down from the bench, she left her gavel behind. It sat there alone on the polished wood, catching the sunlight like a silent witness. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars honked. People hurried to lunch. Pigeons fluttered on the courthouse steps. But inside, in that quiet room where justice was supposed to live, something had shifted. Not with a bang, but with 7 minutes of truth, spoken softly by a man everyone had underestimated. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should have. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, shadowless glow on the scuffed linoleum floor. The judge walked between the 2 marshals, not because she was being forced, but because she didn't know what else to do. Her robe, usually a symbol of authority, now felt heavy, like a costume she'd worn too long without remembering why she put it on in the first place. She kept her eyes forward, jaw tight, but her mind raced. This couldn't be real. Federal oversight? In her courtroom? She'd seen inspectors before, rarely. But they always announced themselves, always came with paperwork, always treated judges with the deference the position demanded. This man hadn't done any of that. He'd sat there like just another person caught in the system, quiet and unassuming, while she dismissed him without a second thought. They turned a corner and stopped at a plain metal door marked "Administrative Hold, Authorized Personnel Only." One of the marshals knocked once, then opened it. Inside was a small windowless room with a table, 2 chairs, and a recording device mounted discreetly on the wall. No bars, no cuffs, no dramatic jail cell, just a space designed for pause, not punishment. "Please have a seat," the inspector said from behind her. He hadn't raised his voice once since revealing his role, but his presence filled the room like steady rain. Calm, constant, impossible to ignore. She sat, folding her hands on the table. The robe's sleeves bunched slightly at her wrists. "This is going to blow back on you," she said, not as a threat but as a statement of fact. People don't take kindly to federal agents ambushing judges over a few sharp words. "It wasn't the sharpness of the words," he replied, taking the chair across from her. "It was what they revealed. Contempt isn't just about disrupting court. It's about undermining the dignity of the process. When a judge mocks a litigant, especially one without a lawyer, it tells everyone watching that the system isn't fair, that it's rigged for those who know how to play it, or those who look a certain way, speak a certain way." She looked away toward the blank wall. "I've handled thousands of cases. You think one comment? Not one," he interrupted gently. "I've been observing your courtroom for 3 days." That stopped her. She turned back, eyes narrowing. "You were here before today?" He nodded. "Monday morning, you told a single mother she should have thought about child support before having kids when she asked for a payment plan. Tuesday, you rolled your eyes and said, 'Oh, another sob story,' when a veteran explained his PTSD affected his ability to pay a citation. And this morning, you called a man one of those people who think rules don't apply to them before he'd even finished his sentence. Her throat tightened. She remembered those moments, but in her mind they'd been offhand remarks venting after long weeks, nothing more. She never thought anyone was really listening. Or that it mattered. I was under pressure, she said, voice lower now. The docket's overloaded. Half these cases shouldn't even be in court. People waste time, lie, play games, and some don't, he said. Like the man this morning. He had proof. He spoke respectfully. He didn't argue, and you still shamed him in front of strangers. She didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick with everything she couldn't say. The sleepless nights, the budget cuts, the feeling that no one appreciated how hard it was to keep order in a system crumbling under its own weight. But none of that excused what she'd done. She knew that now. After a long pause, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small digital recorder. With your permission, I'd like to play back a few moments from this week. Not to embarrass you, but so you can hear what others hear. She hesitated, then nodded. The first clip played. Her voice crisp and cutting, telling a young man he must think the law's a suggestion. The second, her sighing loudly while an elderly woman struggled to explain her medical bills. The third, this morning's comment, replayed in full, followed by the man's quiet reply. Hearing it from the outside was different. Her tone sounded colder than she remembered, sharper, crueler. It wasn't just impatience, it was disdain. And it wasn't isolated. It was a pattern. She looked down at her hands. I didn't realize I sounded like that. Most people don't, he said. That's why oversight exists, not to trap you, but to remind you who you're serving. Just then the door opened slightly. A court clerk stood there holding a manila folder. Sorry to interrupt, she said softly, but I brought the logs you asked for. The inspector thanked her and took the folder. Inside were signed statements from the bailiff, the court reporter, and 2 public defenders, all describing similar incidents over the past months. Not complaints exactly, just observations. Notes like, judge often interrupts defendants, or frequently uses sarcasm when litigants appear nervous. The judge recognized every entry. She'd thought she was being efficient, direct, no nonsense. But reading it on paper, it looked like something else entirely. What happens now? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. You'll remain on administrative leave while the Judicial Conduct Committee reviews the findings, he explained. You'll have a chance to respond in writing, meet with ethics counselors, and, if you choose, participate in judicial sensitivity training. Depending on the outcome, you may return to the bench under supervision, be reassigned, or in rare cases, face removal. She swallowed. And the man this morning? The one I insulted? He's not pressing charges. He's not even involved beyond his official role. But he did ask me to pass along something. He paused. He said, tell her I've seen good judges lose their way. Doesn't mean they can't find it again. She blinked quickly, looking down again. For the first time in years, she felt small, not powerless, but human, flawed, seen. The inspector stood. This isn't the end of your career. It's a crossroads. What you do next matters more than what you did this morning. As he left the room, he didn't slam the door. He closed it softly, like someone leaving a library. Alone now, she sat in the quiet, the weight of her own words echoing in her ears. Outside, the courthouse carried on. Cases called, rulings made, lives changed in quiet, ordinary ways. But inside that small room, something had begun to shift, not because of punishment, but because of truth. And sometimes truth is the only thing strong enough to wake someone up. She took a deep breath, straightened her robe, not as a shield, but as a reminder, and waited for what came next. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Not through headlines or social media. There were no cameras, no recordings released, but through the quiet channels of the courthouse itself. By mid-afternoon, every clerk, bailiff, and public defender knew what had happened. Whispers followed the judge down the hallways earlier that day, but now in her absence the silence spoke louder. People didn't gossip out of malice. They talked because it shook something loose in them, the idea that someone so firmly in control could suddenly be held accountable, not by a scandal or a crime, but by the very standard she was supposed to uphold. Back in the administrative hold room, she wasn't locked in. She could leave if she wanted to, but she stayed. Not because she had to, but because leaving would mean facing the world before she was ready to face herself. A court administrator brought her coffee, black, no sugar, just how she always took it, and a printed copy of the Judicial Code of Conduct. The pages felt heavier than they should have. She flipped through them slowly. Phrases jumped out. A judge shall be patient, dignified, and courteous. A judge shall not manifest bias or prejudice. The integrity of the judiciary depends on public trust. She'd read these lines 100 times during training, recited them during her swearing in, but somewhere along the way they'd become background noise, rules for others, not for her. After all, she told herself, she was the one enforcing the rules. Who was going to hold her to them? Now she knew. Later that day, the inspector returned, not in a rush, not with more accusations, but with a simple request. "I'd like to speak with a few staff members," he said. "Voluntarily, off the record unless they choose otherwise. Just to understand the environment." She nodded. There was no point resisting. And part of her, the part that still believed in fairness even if she'd forgotten how to practice it, wanted to hear what they'd say. One by one, people came in. The bailiff first, a man who'd worked the courtroom for over a decade. He stood near the door, hat in hand, eyes on the floor. "I've seen judges get frustrated," he said quietly. "We all have. But lately, it felt like walking on eggshells. People would come in nervous enough, and then one sharp word from the bench and they'd shut down completely, like they didn't even believe they deserved to be heard." Next was the court reporter, a woman with tired eyes and steady hands. "I transcribe everything," she said. "Every word. And over the last year I noticed the tone changed. Less 'please explain,' more 'spare me.' It wasn't just about efficiency. It felt personal sometimes, like the bench had decided who mattered and who didn't before the case even started. Then came a public defender who'd appeared in her courtroom dozens of times. "Most of my clients are scared," he said. "They don't know the rules. They stumble over their words. A little patience goes a long way. But when they're met with sarcasm or eye-rolling, it tells them the system's already made up its mind. And honestly, after a while I stopped sending my most vulnerable clients to your courtroom if I could help it." Each statement landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. She just listened. And for the first time she saw her courtroom not from the bench, but from the other side of it, from the worn wooden chair where people sat, hoping for fairness and too often finding judgment instead. After the last person left, the inspector sat across from her again. "You're not the first judge this has happened to," he said. "And you won't be the last. The system grinds people down. Caseloads double. Resources shrink. Public trust erodes. It's easy to start seeing litigants as problems to clear, not people to serve." She looked at him. "Then why hold me to a standard no one else seems to meet?" "Because someone has to," he said simply. "If the people on the bench stop believing in fairness, who's left?" She thought about that. Thought about the young man from that morning, the one she'd dismissed so easily. He hadn't yelled, hadn't cursed, hadn't even looked angry. Just disappointed, like he'd expected better. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not that she'd been caught, but that she'd let someone down who still believed in the system enough to show up with proof, with respect, with hope. Later, alone again, she pulled out her phone. She almost called her mentor, the retired judge who'd sworn her in years ago. But she stopped herself, not because she was ashamed, though she was, but because she realized she needed to sit with this discomfort, to let it teach her something. Outside, the courthouse emptied for the day. The lights in the hallways dimmed. The only sound was the hum of the air vents and the occasional footsteps of a janitor pushing a mop bucket down the hall. In that quiet, she thought about all the times she'd rushed through cases, cut people off, made quick judgments to keep the docket moving. She told herself it was for efficiency. But now she wondered, efficiency for whom? Not for the single mother trying to explain why she couldn't pay a fine. Not for the veteran struggling to stand straight in the defendant's chair. Not for the quiet man with a printed email who just wanted to be heard. She stood up, walked to the small mirror on the wall, and smoothed her robe. It still carried the faint scent of coffee and courtroom dust. She didn't take it off, not yet, because even if she wasn't sitting on the bench right now, she was still a judge, and that meant something, whether she was in the courtroom or not. As she stepped out into the hallway, the janitor nodded at her. She nodded back, and for the first time in a long time, she meant it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be meetings, reviews, maybe even public scrutiny if the ethics committee decided to make findings public. But none of that scared her as much as the thought of going back to the way things were, blind to her own power, deaf to the voices in front of her. She walked out of the courthouse not with her head down, but with her eyes open. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows on the steps. People hurried past, lost in their own lives, unaware of the quiet reckoning that had just taken place inside. But she knew, and that was enough for now. The days that followed weren't filled with dramatic confrontations or public apologies. There were no press conferences, no viral clips, no shouting matches behind closed doors. Instead, the real work happened in stillness, in quiet rooms, in late-night reflections, in conversations that left more questions than answers. And for the first time in years, the judge allowed herself to sit with those questions instead of rushing past them. She'd been granted temporary leave, as expected. But what surprised her was the silence that came with it. No calls from colleagues offering support or criticism. No messages from old friends checking in. It wasn't cruelty. It was distance. The legal world moved fast, and when someone stepped out of line, even quietly, it was easier for others to look away than to get involved. She'd done the same herself more than once when another judge faced scrutiny. Now she understood how lonely that felt. But loneliness, she was learning, could be useful. It gave space to think. She spent the first few mornings walking through the city, not with a destination in mind, just moving. She passed courthouses, public libraries, bus stops, places where people waited, hoped, argued, or simply tried to survive another day. She watched how they spoke to clerks, how they held their children's hands while filling out forms, how some stood with their shoulders hunched like they were used to being told no. She'd seen these scenes before, of course, but from the bench they'd been background noise. Now they were the whole story. One afternoon she found herself sitting on a bench across from a small civil court, not hers, but one in a neighboring district. She didn't go inside. She just watched people come and go, a young couple arguing over a parking ticket, an elderly man struggling to carry a stack of documents, a teenager, eyes wide with fear, stepping inside with a public defender at his side. None of them knew who she was, and for once that felt like a gift. Later that week, the inspector contacted her again, not to interrogate, but to offer something unexpected, a chance to sit in on a judicial ethics workshop. It wasn't mandatory. It wasn't part of the investigation. It was simply an invitation. Sometimes, he said over the phone, the best way to understand what went wrong is to hear how others are trying to get it right. She agreed. The workshop was held in a modest conference room at a legal aid center. No robes, no gavels, just folding chairs and coffee and paper cups. Most of the attendees were judges from smaller towns or newer appointees, still learning the weight of the bench. But there were a few seasoned ones too, people who'd made mistakes, faced reviews and chosen to come back differently. One judge, a woman with silver hair and calm eyes, spoke about how she'd once yelled at a defendant who kept interrupting her. "I thought I was keeping order," she said. But later I learned he was hard of hearing and couldn't tell when I'd finished speaking. I never asked. I just assumed he was being defiant. She paused. Humility isn't weakness. It's the foundation of fairness. Another shared how budget cuts had made him short-tempered, until a court clerk gently pointed out that his tone was making people too scared to speak up, even when they had valid defenses. "I thought I was being efficient," he admitted, "but I was just being lazy. Real justice takes time." The judge listened, really listened, without planning her rebuttal or comparing their stories to hers. And in that room, surrounded by people who'd stumbled but hadn't quit, she began to see a path forward, not back to who she was, but toward who she could become. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote for the first time not a ruling, but a reflection. She didn't write for the ethics committee. She wrote for herself. She described the moment she'd dismissed the quiet man, not just what she said, but what she'd felt. Impatience, yes, but also a flicker of superiority. The belief that she already knew his story before he'd told it. That was the real failure, she realized. Not the words, but the assumption behind them. She thought about her early days on the bench. How she'd stayed late to read every file. How she'd asked follow-up questions. How she'd once postponed a hearing because a defendant's child was sick and they couldn't find childcare. Back then, the law wasn't just a set of rules, it was a promise. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing the promise and started seeing only the paperwork. The inspector called again a few days later. This time he asked if she'd be willing to meet with him in person, not as part of the investigation, but as a conversation. She agreed. They met in a quiet cafe far from the courthouse. He ordered tea. She got black coffee. No badges, no titles, just two people talking. "I've reviewed your file," he said after a while. "Not just this week. Your whole record. You've issued fair rulings. You've mentored clerks. You've advocated for better resources. You weren't a bad judge, you just stopped listening." She nodded. "I got tired. And when you're tired, it's easier to see people as cases instead of as people." "That's human," he said. "But the bench isn't just a job. It's a covenant. And covenants require care even when you're exhausted." She looked out the window. "What happens now?" "The committee will review everything, the recordings, the statements, your response. They'll decide if you can return and under what conditions. But I'll tell you this. The fact that you're willing to sit here and admit you were wrong, that matters more than you think." She didn't cry, but something inside her softened like ice finally beginning to melt. That night she dreamed of the courtroom, not the one she knew, but a different version. In the dream, she sat on the bench, but the robe felt lighter. When someone spoke, she leaned forward not to cut them off, but to hear them better. And when the gavel came down, it wasn't a sound of finality, but of balance restored. She woke up before dawn, not with dread, but with a quiet resolve. Whatever came next, whether she returned to the bench or not, she wouldn't forget what she'd learned in these still, honest days. Justice wasn't about power, it was about presence. And presence, she now understood, began with listening. The courthouse looked the same as it always had. Stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps, tall columns casting long shadows in the morning light, the American flag rippling gently in the breeze. But for the judge, everything felt different. She wasn't here to preside. She wasn't even supposed to be noticed. She sat in the back row of a courtroom she used to call her own, wearing plain clothes, hands folded in her lap, just another observer in a sea of quiet faces. Up front, a new judge sat on the bench, someone she'd never met, appointed temporarily while the ethics review wrapped up. This judge spoke slowly, listened carefully, and paused before ruling, as if weighing not just the law but the human being standing before it. When a nervous woman fumbled with her papers, the judge didn't sigh or glance at the clock. Instead, they said, "Take your time. We're here to get it right." Those words, simple, ordinary, landed deep in the former judge's chest. She remembered a time when she would have said something like that too, before the docket got too long, before the frustration built up, before she started believing that speed was the same as justice. The Ethics Committee's decision had come a week earlier, not with fanfare, but in a sealed letter delivered by hand. She hadn't been removed. She hadn't been punished in the way headlines love. Instead, she'd been offered a path back. 6 months of supervised return, mandatory ethics counseling, and a commitment to ongoing training in procedural fairness. It wasn't a clean slate. It was a second chance, with conditions, with accountability, with eyes watching to see if she'd truly changed. She'd accepted without hesitation. But before she could return to the bench, the committee asked her to do something unusual: sit in on other courtrooms for 2 weeks. Not as a judge, not as an authority, just as a witness. "See justice from the other side," the letter read. "Remember what it feels like to wait, to hope to be heard or not." So she did. And today, watching this new judge handle a simple housing dispute with patience and clarity, she finally understood what had been missing. It wasn't about being kind. It was about being present, about treating every person who walked through those doors as if their story mattered, even if it was the 100th story of the day. After the hearing ended, she lingered as people filed out. An elderly man shuffled past, muttering thanks to the clerk. A young mother bounced a fussy toddler on her hip, relief softening her tired eyes. No one recognized her. No one bowed or stepped aside. And that was fine. Better than fine, it was necessary. She needed to remember that the courtroom didn't belong to the judge. It belonged to the people. Later that afternoon, she met the inspector one last time. They sat on a park bench near the courthouse, the kind of place where no one would think to look for either of them. He handed her a folder, her final review summary. "You'll be back on the bench next Monday," he said, "with a supervising judge observing your first 10 sessions. After that, monthly check-ins for 6 months. If all goes well, you'll be fully reinstated." She nodded, holding the folder like it was fragile. "I won't go back to how I was." "I know," he said, "because you're not the same person you were 7 minutes after that gavel fell." They sat in silence for a while, watching pigeons peck at crumbs near a trash can. Then he added, "The man you spoke to that morning, the one you called one of those people, he asked about you." She looked up, surprised. "He did?" "He wanted to know if you were okay. Not as a judge. As a person." She swallowed hard. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were learning." That was enough. The days leading up to her return were quiet. She reread the judicial code, not as a formality but as a promise she was ready to keep. She practiced pausing before speaking. She wrote reminders on sticky notes. Listen first. Assume good intent. They're scared, be steady. Small things. Human things. On Monday morning, she put on her robe again. It still fit, but it felt different. Lighter somehow, as if the weight of arrogance had finally been shed. She walked into the courthouse, not with her chin high, but with her heart open. Her first case was a traffic violation, just like the one that started it all. A young delivery driver had been cited for an expired inspection sticker. He stood at the defendant's table, shoulders tense, eyes darting around like he expected to be scolded before he even spoke. She took a breath. "Please tell me what happened," she said, gently, clearly, without judgment. He blinked, surprised. Then he explained that his company had delayed the inspection due to scheduling issues, and he'd been trying to get it fixed for weeks. He pulled out a work order, a text thread with his manager, even a photo of the appointment confirmation. She looked at the documents. Then she looked at him. "Thank you for bringing this," she said. "It's clear you've made a real effort to comply. The court finds no willful violation. Case dismissed." His eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," she said, and offered a small, genuine smile. "Drive safe." As he walked out, shoulders relaxed for the first time that day, she felt something shift inside her. Not triumph, not relief, but alignment. This was why she'd taken the oath. Not to wield power, but to protect fairness. Over the next few weeks, she moved slower. She asked more questions. She let people finish their sentences. When someone was late or unprepared, she didn't assume laziness. She asked if everything was okay. And slowly the atmosphere in her courtroom changed. People stood a little taller. They spoke more clearly. They trusted just a little that they'd be heard. The supervising judge eventually stopped attending. The monthly check-ins became conversations, not interrogations. And the judge? She never forgot those 7 minutes, the ones that brought her down and the ones that helped her rise again. Months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, she saw a familiar face in the gallery during a break. It was the inspector, sitting quietly in the back, watching. He didn't wave, didn't nod, just sat there like any other citizen observing the law in action. When court adjourned, she walked over. "You came back," she said. "I wanted to see if justice sounded different now," he replied. She smiled. "Does it?" He listened for a moment, to the clerk calling the next case, to the soft murmur of people settling into their seats, to the calm, steady voice of the judge beginning again. "Yes," he said. "It sounds like respect." And in that simple word, the whole story found its ending, not with punishment, but with purpose. Not with shame, but with change. Because real justice isn't about never falling. It's about having the courage to stand back up. And this time, make sure you're standing for the right reasons.